Go back and reread the end of the Mishnah. So this was the very first Mishnah in Parak Kones, Daf Nun Hey on the Bays. And what the Mishnah said was that if you have a animal, it was Nafla Lagina. If an animal that, Rashi said what the case was, but it must have been like a Rosh Hashanah that was above some person's Gina. The animal falls in, some sort of ones, whatever it is, the nenis, Mishlemis Masha nenis. And then the animal has hana, presumably, when you're reading the Mishnah, you think that means he started eating the produce, right? So you don't have to pay the full damage. You only have to pay what you as the owner benefited. By not having to feed your animal lunch, that's what you have to pay, not necessarily the prized tomatoes or whatever it was that was in the garden. And then the Mishnah said, Yarda Kedarka. However, if you just were a posheh and therefore your animal walked into this guy's thing, so then, then, right, so if it's an ones and falls, then it's Mishlemes Masha Nenis. If you were Poshea, then you're Mishlemes Masha Ezi. Okay. So Amar Rav, Benechbeta. Rav said this halacha that applies, that when it falls into the Gina, you only have to pay Mishlemes Masha Nenis, is actually not when the animal ate. It's when what the animal, got hana from was it broke its fall. So this animal was falling from, somewhere higher, and presumably could have really hurt himself. Thankfully, it fell on the soft patch of whatever, and therefore it kind of broke its fall. Now, in the process, you ruined the guy's vegetables or whatever he had. Mm-hmm. So therefore, you don't have to necessarily pay the full value of the vegetables. You have to pay whatever this hana means that you broke the animal's fall. But the implication is that you wouldn't have to pay if you ate it. So the Gemara says, "Aval akla apilu mashenenes." But if the animal after it fell started eating these, the produce, you wouldn't even have to pay at all. Is that what we should take from this? Lema Rav L'Taimei, the Amar Rav Hayalash Lo Tochal. We've seen a similar Rav like this before, and maybe this is Rav's Shita. That maybe you can say to the animal, "Listen, you really shouldn't have eaten." Now, what is this Rav that we're talking about? So this goes back a week or two ago, where the sugya was, what happens if I bring my produce into someone's field, his property, without his rishus, right? I've got a bunch of payros, I bring it into my neighbor's rishus. His property without his rishus. So the halacha is, if that guy's animal, right, if something happens to my produce, then the Baal Habayis is responsible, because he can be like, listen, why'd you bring your stuff into my rishus? No one asked me to do that. However, not only that, if the guy's animal gets damaged by my produce, I'm the one that's responsible. Because again, I should not have brought my produce into this guy's property. That's what the Mishnah says over there. And Rav says a halacha Rav says a chiddush, that halacha, that when the Baal Habayis' animal gets damaged by my produce that I brought in without rishus, it's dafka if he gets damaged by slipping on the produce. But if the animal eats my produce and then he gets damaged, then the halacha is that I am not responsible, meaning me, the Baal Habayis. Why? Because I have a taina that I could have said, you should have controlled your own animal. What's your animal doing? Eating my produce. So if he slips on my produce, fine, that's something else. But if he eats my produce, that was Rav's. It was a big chiddush. We have to understand, going back a few weeks, exactly what the shot was and what the svara is for Rav. But the Gemara is saying maybe here there's a similar thing. When my animal falls from the Rosh Hashanah into someone else's gina, and my animal starts eating the other guy's produce, maybe there's a svara of I can't be held responsible. Maybe the animal shouldn't have eaten. Why is it my fault? Look at the bottom Rashi, the last few words, right? Man yachol asos. Well, what could I have done, right? So maybe I shouldn't be chayiv at all. But the Gemara says, Amri hachi hasha. What type of comparison is that? Amar da Amarav Hasam Hayalosh Lo Tochal Techate Itzaka he, where my food, where the Baal Habayis, the animal, got damaged from my food, Demati Amarle Mari de Peri, where the owner of the fruit can say, Lo Mashamla Hayalosh Lo Tochal, I don't want to pay you for the damage that my fruit caused your animal, because your animal should have eaten my fruit. But La Azuke Hi Achrini de Pakir Lashlume Miyamar. How in the world can I use the same claim when my animal ate someone else's produce? I should be like, how could I control my own animal? I don't know, control your own animal. You know what I mean? So the point is, even to the extent that Rav has a shita like that, which in general is very hard to understand, there's no way you can apply it to a case where my animal ate someone else's produce. And I should be putter because my animal shouldn't have eaten it, right? Ella, so the Gemara says, Lomabaya Kamar. Really, what Rav was saying was Lomabaya. Lomabaya, Achlat, Mishalemes, Mashanenis. For sure, in the case where my animal fell from a Shus Rabim into the other guy's Gina, and it eats, for sure it has to pay Mashanenis. Aval Nechbeta. But let's say my animal didn't eat anything, it just used the produce in the garden to break its fall. Ema, Mabriachari, Minechse Chavero. Umashanenis, Nami Lomashalim, Kamash Mulan. Maybe you'd have a havamina that where my animal didn't eat produce, it just fell into the garden garden broke its fall. Maybe the baal of the behema, the mazik in this case, shouldn't be chayiv, because he could have a taina that he was just a mabriachari. What's this concept of a mabriachari? This is the idea that sometimes, even if I receive some sort of benefit, as long as it's just someone preventing harm to myself as opposed to benefiting me, maybe I don't have to pay them. So the classic example, literally the Mabriach Ari, is imagine I've got my whole flock of animals and there's a lion that's coming, it's going to eat all my animals, right? A whole herd, school, I have no idea what they call, a whole thing of pack, a whole thing of herd, a whole herd of lions are going to come and they're going to attack my animals. And I stand to lose a lot of money. My neighbor's in Atzala and he flips on his siren and it freaks out all the lions and they all run away. So my neighbor can, you can say to me, listen, you were about to lose thousands of dollars, right? You should really pay me. I can say, listen, you were just a mabriachari. You just prevented my loss, but I don't owe you any money. And maybe the same things can apply here. When my animal, his fall was broken because of this produce, maybe I can say, it's true, you did save me money. My animal was about to die because it was going to fall from, this whole thing and it would have killed itself. Your produce really broke the fall, but you were only a mabriachari. You just prevented my loss. So I don't really owe you any money. So the Gemara says that it's not a bad svara of Ema Chanami. Maybe that should be the svara, meaning Kamash Mala in the Mishnah, that you do have to at least pay Mashanenes. Why? Ema Chanami, right? Why can't we say Mabriachari? So the Gemara says, no, Mabriachari v'nichs chavero midaito. Hi, lab midaito. Mabriachari, the guy has to make a conscious decision to do you a favor, to flip on his atzala light or his siren, right? This guy didn't do anything. You fell into his garden. Right, so you can't fall into his garden, ruin his stuff, and then say, "Oh, Mabriachari, I don't want to pay you." No, I mean, if he wanted to offer to be a Mabriachari, that's his prerogative. He didn't make any offer. Inami, maybe the more obvious difference. Mabriachari less they pseudo. When a guy scares away the lions, he's not going out of pocket, right? He's doing something that doesn't cost him anything. Hi is lepseudo, right? This case, you just ruined his garden patch. Right, so you can't just say Mabriachari. Of course, you got to pay him at the very least Mashanenis. Okay, so we're on Nunches Amud Aleph. We're about 7 lines from the top. Again, the halacha in the Mishnah was that when you have an animal, and the animal's in Rosh Hashanah,
the owner of the animal should pay the owner of the garden.
Exactly.
The value of what was damaged.
So not exactly the value of what was damaged, but at least what he benefited from Mashanenis. All right. So again, the case is you've got an animal in a Rosh Hashanah, right? And the animal falls from Rosh Hashanah into a garden. We say you're chayav, right? Mishalemes at least mashanenes. So the Gemara says, "Hey chinaka, what exactly is this case? How did this animal fall?" Kahana Amar shehuchlaku b'meimei ragleha. The animal slipped on. He went to the bathroom and then it slipped, on that, and that's how it fell. Right? Rava Amar shedach b'sach. Rava says, no, you're walking with a pack of animals, and one of them pushed the other one. That's how it fell off. Right? So both of them, I guess, are kind of a case of an onus. And the Gemara kind of takes for granted that clearly the case of slipping on your own urine is a little bit more of an onus than one of the animals pushing the other animals. The Gemara says, Manda Amar shedach b'sach chaverta. If you say that dach b'sach chaverta, the case where one sheep pushes the other sheep, and that constitutes an onus, so then then of course you're going to hold that the other case of an animal slipping after it went to the bathroom is for sure going to be an onus. But if you say that the onus here is someone that is the animal that slipped after going to the bathroom, the case of where an animal pushed the other animal, that might be a case of pshia, not a case of onus. And therefore, you wouldn't have the benefit of only paying what you were nenes. You would have to pay the full amount of the damage to Amar Lei, because the nizik can say, right? This isn't an onus. You should have walked your animal single file, especially in the place where it was on the edge, right? And therefore, if one of the animals pushed the other, that is really on you. Okay. And again, what is the halacha? If the animal falls and the animal starts eating and it fell ba'ones, it only pays masha nenes. It doesn't pay the full amount of masha ezeka. It only pays masha nenes. Amar kahana lo shanu ela ba'osa aruga. This chiddush, this leniency that you only pay masha nenes is dafka right when you fall if you eat, in that aruga. Aval me aruga la aruga mishlomas masha ezeka. But once the initial impact wears off, now you're just like walking around the field eating. At that point, it's Mishalemas Masha Ezika, right? The owner's got to realize that his animal is in someone's garden. He's got to pull him out, right? So again, the initial fall, you start eating fine, but then once you start walking around, then you got to grab the animal. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, no, he disagrees. Afilu me'aruga la'aruga v'afilu kol hayam kulo asher teitze v'tachzor ladas. No, absolutely not. You basically, once you're in this garden, you are grandfathered in, and now you can just eat away, and the halacha is going to be Shalemes Mashanenes. Once the animal comes out, then already the owner's got to watch his animal, and then if it comes back in, then they're going to be Shalemes Mashanenes. And Amar of Pupper.
I think they're talking Aruga, those in Israel when they have the sides of mountains and steps, and they have gardens in each step.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
I think it's fallen from
one of those to the next.
Like the backyard of Wilson House.
Yeah. All right, very good. Amar of Papa, Rav Papa says this chiddush of Rav Yochanan that again, once you're kind of in the garden, you can eat all day. It's only when you leave, that's when you can't really come back in. So Amar of Papa, lo teimach teitze ladas v'tachzor ladas. Ela kevan sheyazas ladas, apa pitachazor shelo ladas. My time, Adamar le kevan dilfa claims the mishtamata lahasam rata. So Rav Papa says basically a chiddush, right? If you recall, going back to the very, very, very first words of our Mishnah, the Gemara made a diak that we're dealing with son. Son l'dir, we're not dealing with shars anymore. And the reason is we're dealing with the nezek of, we'll go with Shane, right? And therefore, Shane requires a lesser shmira than a shor does, right? When it comes to goring. And therefore, as long as you just lock the pen, that's all you did, Karen. As long as you just lock the pen, that's really all you need for Shane. And what our Papa is teaching us over here is he's saying, even if you're Rav Yochanan, who says that when an animal falls in ba'ones, you kind of have all day, while you have this leniency of Mishlemes Mashanenis. But once the animal comes out, this leniency of Shane no longer applies to this animal. Meaning at this point, if the owner locked the pen, but then the animal got out, the owner can no longer say, he no longer has the time of saying, listen, I did everything I was supposed to do, right? Once the animal tasted this garden, you have to understand that even if you lock him in a pen, the second he gets out, he's bolting straight to this garden. So you got to do more of a shmira. So again, the words are kind of hard to, that's the way Rashi understands what our Papa is saying. So it's lo temach petzi ladas v'tachzor ladas. Don't say it's only if the animal comes out and then kind of pipshia, it comes back into the garden. It's elakaven shiyatzas ladas. Once you take it out, even if the animal comes back into the garden, shelo ladas, meaning the way Rashi says, you've locked your pen properly, you've done everything you're supposed to do for Shane, and normally you would be pater. In this case, you would still be chayav my time adamar lay, because the nizik can say kaven dilfa. Once the animal learned about this garden, so kol amos dimish tamata, every time it leaves lahasam rata, it's going to run to this garden, and therefore you need like an added shmira for this animal. Okay. So now the Mishnah said yarda kedarka ve'ezika mashlemet mashezik. So that was all if it fell from something into a garden. But what if the animal, right? You were supposed to lock your pen properly, and you didn't lock your pen properly, and now this thing goes and it walks into someone else's garden and it does damage. So now you got to be yerchayev the entire amount. And what we said was, and this is where we're going to really roll our sleeves up and kind of get into the math, but we said it's kind of a unique way of how you calculate what the damage is, and that's really what we're going to be doing on Amud Beis. Before we get there, by Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah had a shayla. He said, Yarja kedarka v'hizika b'mei leida mahu. Let's say you were a poshea, you didn't lock up your thing properly, and the animal goes, but instead of eating, which is what we would have assumed the animal would do, it ends up giving birth. And when it gives birth, it creates a mess, and that messes up, a row of produce. So mahu. So aliba demand amar tchilas of pshia v'sova ba'ones chayiv lo tibarlach. If you hold that tchilas of pshia v'sova ba'ones is chayiv, so you're not going to have a kasha, right? Then this guy's going to be chayiv, even to the extent he was a tchilas of pshia v'sova ba'ones. But if you hold it's chayiv, so this guy's going to be chayiv. Ki tibarlach. When would you have a shaila? Aliba demand amar tchilas of pshia v'sova ba'ones pater. My mi amrinan came on the tchilas of pshia v'sova ba'ones pater. Do you say this is a case of tchilas of pshia v'sova ba'ones, and therefore this guy would be pater? O dilma hachakula b'pshiahu. This entire case is the case of pshia. The cave in the kachazi, the kribale lamelad. Once you know that this animal is getting ready to give birth, ibayale linture l'stamure bigava teku. You should have known, and you should have been more careful with it, and therefore that's the shaila. So in a case like this, is this chayev or pater? Again, teku. So we'll turn the page. Nun ches amid beis top of the amid. So keitza mishalemes ma shehizika, right? So how exactly do we assess the damage? And what the Mishnah said, again, is clearly what we do, high level, is we don't just say you damage 10 rows of produce, you gotta pay for 10 rows of produce. We make some sort of evaluation based on some larger plot of property, and then we do kind of a with and without. This larger plot of property would be worth X, and now that it's missing 10 rows, it's worth Y. And that's all done as like a favor to the mazik. Because if we just looked and we isolated these 10 rows, he would have to pay a lot more than if we look at the broader picture and the damage done to the broader field. So again, we are going to get into the math in a minute, but before we get there, the Gemara says, Manan Emili, how do I even know to do this? I mean, why don't I just do the more simple, like you damage 10 rows, you got to pay 10 rows. So Amar of Masa, the Amar Kruk, as the pasuk says, Ubier b'stei acher. That's the pasuk of Shein and Regel. Melame teshamin al gav sada acher. You have to make your shuma with kind of as this damage relative to kind of a broader field. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? Hayu bier b'stei acher mi bayale la fukir shesarabim. One of the ikr qualities of Shein Regel is that you're patron shesarabim. You're only chayiv if you do it in Rosh Hashanah. How do I know? Because the pasuk says it. So that pasuk is very much needed for an ikr halacha in Shein and Regel to teach me that I'm pater Shein and Regel in Rosh Hashanah. So how am I using bi'er b'stei acher teach me this other halacha? I need it to teach me that I'm pater in Rosh Hashanah. Gemara says in Cain, l'chtav rachmano bi'er b'stei chaveiro. You didn't have to say acher. You could have said b'stei chaveiro. Inami stay acher. You did not need the base. My b'stei acher sheshamin al gav sada acher. Gemara says, oh, it's a good point. Why don't, now that you said Ubier b'stei acher teaches me that this is how I make my shuma when I need to pay for the damage. Maybe that's what Ubier b'stei acher means. How do I know that I'm pater Rosh Hashanah? So im kain lichtavei rachmana gabi tashlumin. This b'stei acher should have been written in the part of the pasuk that dealt with tashlumin. What should the pasuk have said? Meitav sadehu umeitav karma yishalim b'stei acher. Lamli the customer rachmana gabi ubier shmamina tarti. So that's how I know both of these halachas. On the one hand, I know that Shein and Regel is pater Rosh Hashanah. On the other hand, I know that when I have to calculate the damages, I do so relative to another field. So Heichli Shain Binan, bottom line. Now we're going to get into it. How do I do this shuma? Right? So Amar Rav Yossi Bar Chanina, Sa B'Shishim Sim. Those are 3 words that there's a lot packed into these 3 words. And if you look at Rashi, basically what Rashi says is, this is the issue that we're dealing with. You can't focus on the 10 rows that we did the damage to, right? Because that wouldn't be fair to the mazik, right? On the other hand, we need to look at it more broadly and see like what's the right way to do this calculation. The problem is, if you took the field as a whole or something like that, there isn't a real market for this particular field, or a field of this size, I should say. And therefore, the price you get is going to get a little bit messed up. So what we need to do is we need to come up with a way of like converting this field into something that's marketable. And now we can get a good sense of what the market rate today is on a field. Once we have that amount, we can work backwards. Now, what is that amount? So Rashi says, in the first sheet here says, that is Shishim Sa. Base Sa. No, Shishim Sa. Not Base Sa is 1. Shishim Sa. Shishim Sa is a very, very, very large amount. That is, that's like the equivalent of like, I don't know, an acre, or, I don't know how you sell, fields or whatever it is. But the point is, Shishim Sa, that gives us an idea of what the market is today for fields, whatever it is. The problem is, Alan, is if I looked at Shishim Sa with these 10 rows and Shishim Sa without these 10 rows, it's going to be pennies because once someone's buying Shishim Sa, they're not going to care about the 10 rows. So that wouldn't be fair to the Nizik. So we got to, Shishim Sa establishes our market price. Now we got to work backwards and we divide the Shishim Sa by Shishim to get us to a base Sa. That's what the Mishnah talked about. Once we have our base Sa calculated with, the right market rate, now we can say a Sa with the 10 rows and without the 10 rows. That we can have a bit of a better appreciation of what the damage really was. And that's kind of what the Mazik.
Okay, the base is 1/60th or 2/60th?
1/60th of the Shishim Sa.
It's 1/60.
The base Sa is 1/60th of the Shishim. So we use Shishim Sa as our way of establishing the price. Then once we have our price for the Shishim Sa, we just divide it by 60, so we can get to our base Sa. And then we do our with and without calculation.
The base saw is the amount of produce that a certain size field can produce.
I don't know. But a base Sa is the right size where we'll get a good sense of how the value will change with these rows and without these rows. I guess so. For a saw produce. Either way, so that's the first sheet. That's kind of the way we do it. That's the methodology. Rav Yanai Amar Tarkov B'Shishin Tarkavim. He doesn't disagree with the methodology whatsoever. He just says that instead of 60 saw, it should be 60 Tarkovs, which is a half saw. So 30 saw. Meaning the debate over here is what's the right size to establish the market. If you get into Rashi gets into some of these things they're a little too large for the small players, a little too small for the big players. You got to really figure out what's the right, what are people buying? What's the equivalent of an acre in those days? That's what I'm not even an economist, almost like someone that's in this business that understands, like, what are people buying and selling? The Gemara is really going to get into some of the stuff. Chizkiah is like, I don't know what you guys are talking about. Like, Chizkiah says, no, it's klach, b'shishim, klachim. You look at the damage, the 10 rows, multiply it by 60, and that gives you enough to work with. You don't need to start dealing with base saws and Tarkovs and all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit more, so he's maybe the easiest shita to understand, but bottom line, all three of the shitas all say that using some measure of 60, you got to multiply the actual damage to come up with something else. That's what all the shitas are. So space. So we're going to have a brisa that asks really answers all three of these shitas. Achla kav o kabayim. If someone did a kav or a kabayim of damage, which apparently is not a very large number, ein omrim tishalim demeyan ela roanosa ilu hi aruga katana mashayrinasa. So we don't say pay the kav or the kabayim, right? Because that would be unfair to the mazik. We say you look at the whole field and you say the whole field. How would it impact the price of this field? What's the point, right? My lav doesn't sound like you're multiplying anything by 60. You just take a look at the field, which is exactly what we said you don't do, right? Each one of these three shitas, they all disagreed, but none of them said you do this. They all said you have to multiply by 60. The Gemara says, lo, b'shishim. That brisa was just speaking shorthand, but when it says mishayrim also, you do it via shishim. Okay. Tana Rabbanan. Ein shamin. This is going to be a bit of a cryptic brisa. Ein shamin kav b'pnei shemashbicho below base kur b'pnei shapogmo. The Gemara says when you're dealing with damage, you don't evaluate the kav because that would be mashbiach someone. Below base kur, you also wouldn't look at it from a base kur, which is a much larger quantity of land, pogmo, because that would weaken someone. So my kamar, what exactly is this price saying? So Amar Papa Haki Kamar. Ein shamin kav b'shishim kavim, b'nei mashbiach mazik, v'lo kur b'shishim kurin, b'nei pogem mazik. And the way Rav Papa explains it like this. A kav is apparently a smaller measure of real estate. And if you multiplied the kav by shishim, again, you somehow, this would be unfair to the mazik because the way Rashi explains, again, you're kind of in this middle where like you got a parcel that's a little too big for some of the aniyim. It's not really big enough for even the mid-tier players. So you're just getting a goofy price. And then if you start working with that price and start calculating the damage, it's a little unfair to the mazik. On the other hand, a kur, if you get a kur's worth of damage, which is apparently a tremendous amount of damage, and if you multiply that by 60, So you have to Shishin Kurim, that also would be unfair to the Mazik. Why? That apparently is so large that the only players that are in the game are the very, very, very wealthy people. And they are willing, and when the right thing comes along, they just overpay. And because they overpay, it's the same thing. If you're going to say, all right, so this guy was willing to pay $1 million for this thing, and now you start working backwards to see, proportionally how much the damage was, that's going to be way more than what the Mazik should have to pay. And that's the way Rav Papa explained. So when it's a kav, shishin doesn't work because it's unfair to the mazik. And even when it's a base kur, it's not fair to the mazik because, again, just based on how you would establish a market price, you're not getting a market price on either of these two sizes. So that's how Rav Papa wanted to understand this brisa.
We had the previous Gemaras in Bava Kama, that where we had to pay according to Sivugim, where there were the superior lands, the middle lands.
Meitav, yeah.
And the bad, and the bad properties, because properties can be different pricing, even though they're the same size.
Of course,
in
yeah.
Different areas. The same thing here. I mean, you have the person, the cow or whatever going to the garden is damaging the land.
Yeah.
It could be good land, medium land,
Yeah.
not so good land location. The other thing is you buy a piece of land, the produce on the land, let's say, in 1 year equals $1,000.
Yeah.
You're not gonna pay $1,000 for a piece of land, you're gonna pay 5,000, 10,000.
Yeah.
It's a multiplier effect. And they're not taking into account that. Totally lost on how they're.
So just to speak to your first question, right? The whole concept of Meitav Sadeyu and paying idis, right, or paying baininus, that concept is once we know that the dollar amount that you owe someone is $1,000, you have to pay the $1,000 from the idis, right? So whether it's of the mazik or the nizik, this is the focus or Akiva or Bishmal, which by the way will come up in Nun Tat Samad Aleph again. But that's so meaning once we have the dollar amount, that's how the mazik pays. The mazik can only pay what he has, right? But he's got to pay the meitav of whatever he has. Right now, we're focusing on how do we come up with the $1,000. How, right? So, and to your second question, when a guy damages, produce, the question is, how should he pay? One way of doing it, the simple way would be to say, you damaged 10 rows, what's it going to cost this guy to fix up his 10 rows, right? So that's one way of doing it. But they say that would be, that would be unfair to the mazik, and therefore we look at it a different way. How much was his field actually damaged? To your point, right? If the field was worth $10,000 and now he's got these 10 rows that he's going to have to fix up, what would a buyer pay for it? If it was worth $10,000 yesterday, maybe it's worth $9,500 today because the buyer knows he's got to put in some work. So maybe the damage was only $500, right? And that's kind of what we're trying to figure out right now. But the way in which we do it, we're trying to figure out if we're going to say how much is this piece of property worth before and after. We need to know how do we determine the piece of property, right? This thing's not for sale right now, so it's a little unfair to say,
Okay, but as soon as it, again, sell price of the property, what one piece actually costs. So the person who did the damage, who's liable, can end up paying more than just. He's going to be at fault for a greater amount. That's the thing that I'm getting.
All right. Well, all right.
Maybe we'll get there.
Okay.
Or not.
Either way. So this is how Rav Papa wanted to understand that pricing.
1/6 of base.
All right. So Maskeva Rav Huna Bar Manoach. So Rav Huna Bar Manoach had a kasha on the way Rav Papa wanted to understand that pricing. It says high below base kur mebarle. He actually had a pretty technical kasha on the way Rav Papa. Meaning, if you go back to the brisa said Ein Shamin Kav below base kur. It wasn't speaking apples to apples. It said a kav on the one hand and a base kur, which is like an area on the other. And he said, if the way you were explaining this brisa, it wouldn't make sense for the brisa to shift the tone, shift the language. He said, I'll tell you how to understand this brisa. Ein shamin kav b'fnei atzmo b'fnei mashbiach nizik. You can't, and I think this is really exactly the point that Mark is making. You can't just focus on the row of damage itself, because that would unfairly be good to the nizik. Because again, that damage is a lot more than the actual field was devalued. The actual work it's going to take to to, fix up this aruga is a lot more than the actual damage that was done to the field as a whole. Below kav, the base core, mazik. So then again, if you then look at the field, so then, if you say, well, let's kind of zoom out a little bit and see how much damage is done to the field. If you look at the field on too big of a basis, then you're going to mess up the nizik. Because, for example, if you say, all right, you damaged 10 rows of field. Let's look at the field on a 10-acre basis and how much would a buyer pay differently based on these 10 rows of produce. I was like, come on, 10 acres. I mean, it's not even pennies, right? So again, in trying to figure out the right amount, how do we look at this damage? You can't be too focused on the 10 rows themselves. That wouldn't be fair to the mazik. You also can't zoom out and look at 10 acres because that wouldn't be fair to the nizik. So what's the amount that you have to do? Ella b'shishim. So that's, again, each Tana will do, explain shishim the way they did. But the way you need to do it is by this use of shishim. 60 times the damage of whatever this is. That's how, you establish a market rate, and then you kind of divide that by 60 to kind of come up. Basically, all the different things that we were talking about earlier. Again, these are all different ways, really getting a really Mark's question of what is the proper way? How can we evaluate what the damage that this mazik did to this nizik? So now we have a little story. Ahu gavra to cut kasba mechabre. A man came and he cut down the palm tree of his friend. Now remember, up until now, we've been dealing with animals eating produce. Now we've got a person just coming and chopping down a tree, right? So Aslik made the Reish Galusa. They came to the Reish Galusa, and Amar Le, the Reish Galusa said as follows: said Lididi, Chazili, Plasa, Talsa, Bekina, Abukaini. There were 3 similar trees over here. Abu Shavu, Mea, Zuzi. And the 3 trees combined were worth 100 zuz. Dil Havle, Plitz, and Vitilsa. So pay 33 in the third, right? That's a third of the 3 trees. So if all the trees are worth 100, you cut down one of the trees, pay 33 and a third. So Amar, the Nizik said, God, Reish Galusa to Dain Dina the Parsa Lamali. What do I need to come to this ridiculous Reish Galusa who does these Gaisha courts? What type of Jewish thing is this? You just pay a third of the damage? That's not how we've been talking up until now. So Asmei Rav Nachman comes to Rav Nachman. Amar Le B'shishim. You got to work out what this tree was worth based on a field that's larger and B'shishim. All this calculations that we've been talking about, right? Which again would give a much better answer to the mazik. So Amar Le Rava. So Rava said to Rav Nachman, Im Amr Beniske Momono Yom Beniske Gufo. Well, that's what we pointed out earlier. Rava said to Rav Nachman, this whole concept of shishin is when your mammon goes and does damage. When you Adam Amazik, when you chop down a tree, if you look at shishin, maybe you should be liable for whatever you did, right? So how do I know to apply the same concept of shishin when it's Adam Hamazik, when it's the person himself who chopped down a tree? Maybe that's gufa only for animals. So Amarle Abaya Rava. So Abaya said to Rava, Beniske Gufo my daitach. Why would you assume that Niske Gufo is any different than Niske Mimono? We'll say outside of what he's about to do, because we're going to read a bunch of lengthy prices. Abaya says to Rava like this: why do you think Niske Gufo is any different? I'll tell you why. Because there's a brisa that you must know that talks about Adam Amazik that doesn't make any reference to Shishin. But what Abai is going to say is, I can show you another brisa that clearly is referring to animals doing damage. It's a very lengthy brisa. But the bottom line is, nowhere in that brisa mentions Shishin. And we know that the halacha must be Shishin, because by animals it definitely is Shishin. So I'll tell you, Rava, that the same way that the brisa by animals didn't mention Shishin, but it meant Shishin, so too the brisa that you know of that deals with Adam Hamazik doesn't say Shishin, but it must mean Shishin. And this is really a bias kasha on Rava. So let's read it inside. Again, Amarle Abaya Rava, Meniske Gufa my daitach. What do you think? Why Adam Amazik wouldn't have to pay Shishin to Tanya? Because we have this price. There's a mafkir karmo shel chavero shmadar. A guy comes, this is Adam Amazik, and he ruins the karam of his friend, the vineyard, while it was still in the smudder stage, this budding grape stage. So Rowan also the right? You got to do some sort of evaluation, with and without. You got to look at the field, whatever you do. But there's no mention of Shishin. You just kind of look at the field, what it was worth before the damage, look at the field after it was damaged. So Atu Gabi Behemto Nami, don't we have a similar brisa by Behema? Milo Tanya, don't we also have a brisa Kiai Kavna? The Tanya, this is a brisa. Again, it's a very long brisa. Katma Nitia, this is Rashi says the proper girsa should be, let me just find the girsa, the Rashi, so Rashi Katma Nitia, Rashi says Garcinan Behema should Katma Nitia. So we're dealing with an animal that ate this small natia, this planting or whatever it is. Rabbi Yossi Omar Gozre Zero Shebushalayim Omrim. The Gozre Zero Shebushalayim used to say natia bashnasa. If the natia was a bashnasa, shtei kesef, that was the amount. Bashtei shanim arba'a kesef, that was that amount. Next case, achla chaziz. Let's say the animal ate chaziz is Rosh Hashanah. So this is a very premature stage of grain. So that's what this animal ate. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer nidon b'meshuyir shavo. Very interesting. Rashi says, basically, you kind of hold off. You wait and see what the harvest is going to bring that year, right? Once the grain would have grown. Once the harvest grows, and now you can work backwards and say, wow, these 10 rows would have been whatever it is. So you kind of hold off. You look at what it's going to be. That's what you have to pay the nizik. Oh, very good. Yeah, no, you're right. It's a good question. I don't know. Maybe this is. I don't know.
The damages of my milk supply.
But Chachamim omrim ro no sakama ha'isa yafa v'kama hiyafa. The Rabbanan, they argue and they say no. Rashi says they're being more makel. They're saying no. You look at it right now. How much did you impact the field? Achla smother. Second case. Again, this is all this one lengthy brisa. Let's say the animal, instead of eating the shachas, which is the premature grain, they had premature grapes. These are grapes in the smudar stage, budding grapes, whatever this. Again, I don't have a real appreciation for the difference between all these things. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, like Rabbi Yosef Aglili in Amud Beis, he says, "Ro noson kilu ein anavim omdos libatzer." You have to hit pause, see what these things are going to grow into, and then you work backwards and say you owe him, I don't know, whatever these grapes were, right? Nah, Rowan kama aisi yafa, the kama he yafa. You just look and see, how the vineyard is impacted by the damage. Again, a little bit more makel. Reb Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Reb Shimon, and Reb Shimon ben Yehuda said in the name of Reb Shimon, Bamed Bar Mamurim, they agree with the Chachamim that you just do kind of a with and without calculation. That's bisman she'achla lul ufei kafanim v'yachore te'enim. That's dafka where the produce that you ate was in a really young stage, even younger than smother. Aval achla pagim o bosar, but if it was in a stage even later than smother, so again, you've got, I guess, this lule fanim, that's kind of like really infancy. Then you've got smother, and then you've got pagim o bosar. Then ronos o kilo navim omdos libatzer. And then you do, like what Rabbi Yeshua said, you then view what the grapes would have been, right? One thing that the Gemara is going to get back to is this last shita never really talks about smudar itself. It talks about what you do if it was pre-smudar. It talks about what you do if it was post-smudar. It's a little unclear what you do if it's actually smudar. So the Gemara is going to get to there. But again, this was all one long brisa. Bottom line, Abai is talking to Rava. What does Abai say to Rava? He says, Rava, you thought that when Adam Hamazik does the damage, you don't do Shisha. Why did you think so? Because you presumably had a brisa that mentioned when Adam Hamazik does damage, you don't do Shisha. I have a brisa that I just brought to you, a very lengthy brisa, dealing with behemoths doing damage, and there's no mention of Shishin. So Ktani Miyat.
What's this idea of Shishin again?
That was what we were talking about on Amud Beis, that whenever you calculate the damage, you first have to create this market rate of what is the shishim sa of a field. That establishes the market. Then shishim sa. Yeah.
That's a huge amount.
Exactly. That is apparently what that's what people were buying and selling.
I thought we were talking about a base saw.
Exactly. Problem is people weren't buying and selling base saws in that quantity. But so that you need to establish the price by looking at the 60 saw. The problem is if you stop there and you try to evaluate 10 rows of damage in the quantity of 60 saw, it's not going to be worth very much. So once you have your rate, your market price of 60 saw, you work backwards, you divide it by 60. Now you have a saw. Now a saw you can work with and understand what the damage was, right? By looking at a saw's worth of property minus the 10 rows or with the 10 rows. So this is kind of, that was what we were talking about on the customer base.
So the Shishin is a much larger area.
Yes, much larger than the base saw.
Good example of it.
Yeah, listen,
If you buy something that's 1 square foot, a piece of land that's 1 square foot, you don't do that, but you might buy something that's 60 square feet. So in order to figure out the damage that was done to the 1 square feet, Divide by 60 and then divide by 60.
Yeah. All right. But the bottom line is, Abai is saying to Rava, you thought that this concept of shishiman and the way that we evaluate this damage is dafka by animals and not Adam Mazik. Why? Because you had a brisa by Adam Mazik that didn't mention shishim. I have a brisa that deals with behemoths that also doesn't mention shishim, right? Tani mihat, chachamim omrim, roan osan kama haisa yafa v'kama hi yafa, below tani shishim. But clearly we know that shishim does apply by animals. Everyone agrees to that. So elamai salamemar, b'shishim anachanam b'shishim. The brisa, it was unspoken, but the brisa meant that when you do this valuation, you do it. But you do it based on this idea of shishim. So too, your brisa of Adam Mazik didn't specify, didn't say it outright, but it meant b'shishim. So Amar Abaya, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and Abaya said that Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Rabbi Shmuel Amar Davar Echad. So again, what would Rabbi Yossi Haglili say in the brisa? What do we need? That when an animal damages shachas, we don't look at the damage right now. We wait, we hit the pause. We say, how much is this thing going to be worth post-harvest? And that's how we do the valuation. So Abaye says that this idea of Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Yishmael, they said the same thing. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili had Amran. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that was in our brisa, that we know. Rabbi Yishmael, what is this Rabbi Yishmael? Titania, we have a brisa. It's amazing how Mark talked about this just 10 minutes ago. Meitav Sedeu, Meitav Karma Yishalem, Meitav Sedeu Shal Nizik, Meitav Karma Shal Nizik, Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. When we look at the Meitav Sedeu, we focus on the Nizik's profit. Rabbi Akiva Omer Loba Kazavel Gbos Zikim Min Idis, Mikabel Chomer Lahektish. Again, a very cryptic response, but the bottom line was the Machlokas, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael was you look at the Meitav Sedeu of the Mazik or of the Nizik. And if we go back in that Gemara, the Gemara was trying to understand what Rabbi Yishmael meant, and one of the suggestions was, regardless of what you damage of the nizik, a row of bad produce, you still have to pay a row of good produce of the mazik, of the nizik. And the Gemara said, come on, that can't be a motzei mechaber lavaraya. Why would you ever pay what you didn't damage? Not a motzei mechaber. Why would you ever pay what you didn't damage? So then Rabbi Idi Bar Avin said, oh, I'll tell you what the pshat is. Maybe it's if you don't know what you damaged, you always pay the meitav. And to that, the Gemara said, the Gemara is just kind of going midstream. So the Gemara says, below Tamak, Rav Idi Bar Avin, don't say the pshat is like Rav Idi Bar Avin, to Amar Rav Idi Bar Avin, Kigon Sha'achva Aruga Ben Harugos, below Yadina Nikusha Havai, Ishmena Havai, to Amar Kum Shlim Shmena B'meitav, the Ika Hashta, right? Rav Idi Bar Avin was trying to explain Rabbi Yishmael, and he said, maybe the pshat is that when you don't know what you damage, you always pay the meitav. But the Gemara says, the Hachilo Amridan, my time, you would never say that because let the nizik prove to you that you damaged the meitav. Elamai, ela b'meitav delakamei. And umay niu kiech t'salek. So Abaye says, I'll tell you what Rabbi Shmuel meant. He meant, like Rabbi Yossi Aglili meant, he meant that, what do we say b'meitav of the nizik? It means if you damage produce in its infancy stage, we wait and see what that produce would have become, and that's what you have to pay. So Rabbi Shmuel, this is Abaye talking, Rabbi Shmuel really agrees to this chiddush of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Okay. Amar Mar, Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, Omer Mishum Reb Shimon, Bamed Var Mamurim. What is this? When do I agree to the Chachamim that you just look at the field with the damage and you look at the field without the damage? That's Sha'achla Lulei Kfanim. That's only, or Vichora Te'enim. That's only if you did damage when the produce was really, really, really young. The implication being, Smadar, let's say it was already in the stage where it was budding, then Rowanos Okilo and Avim Ovdos Sibatzer. Then he would agree to Rav Yoshua, and he would say that you look at the full-size grapes. But then look at the Seifa. Achla Pagim Ubosar, if Rav Shimon said that if it's Pagim or Bosar, which again is a stage post Smadar, that's when Hudaronos Okilo and Avim Ovdos Sibatzer. That's when you look at whether the stuff is, you look at them as if they were the grapes that were ready to be harvested. The implication being hasmadar, if it was in a stage a little bit more premature than the pagim or bosar, then you would rono sokama hiyafah v'kama ha'isiyafah. But the bottom line is we have a bit of a stira, right? We kind of pointed this out when we were learning the brisa. The Rabbi Yeshua is talking about smadar. The Chachamim are talking about a different stage. Rabbi Shimon seems to, he kind of talks about a stage that's pre-smadar, and he talks about a stage that's post-Smadar. He doesn't really talk about Smadar. And in fact, the way the Gemara asked it, it's almost like a stira. Which way is actual Smadar? So Amar Ravina, you just got to edit the Bryce a little bit. Kroch Batani. Bemed Varma Murim. Bisman Shachalu like Fanim Vichoret Einim. Reb Shimon agrees with the Chachamim whenever it's really in its infancy. Aval Achla Smadar Pagin Obosar, but when it's either Smadar or even later than Smadar Pagin Obosar, then Roanos on Kilo and Avim Omdos Libatzer. But the Gemara says if this is the case, then really Reb Shimon is just agreeing with Reb Yeshua. What did Reb Yeshua say? If it was Smadar, so then you look at it as if it was grapes ready for harvest. And what does Reb Shimon say in a lot more words? If it was Smadar or after Smadar, you look at it as if it was grapes. The Gemara says, Yahachi, Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, Hein Reb Yeshua. Isn't Reb Shimon ben Yehuda basically just Reb Yeshua? Yikabeinayu kachash gufna below Mesaimi. The difference between the two is this idea of kachash gufna, and the Gemara says below Mesaimi. I don't know which one says what. So what is this idea of kachash gufna? It's fascinating. What's the shita of Reb Yeshua, right? You damaged budding grapes. And what are we going to do? We're going to look as if the Karen grew the grapes to the full potential, and that's how we evaluate the damage. So there's at least one of the two shitas says, wait 1 second, if these vines grew grapes to their full potential, there would be some depreciation on the vines, right? That takes some of the life out of the vines going forward. Now that the animal ate the smadar, it kind of, at the very least, it kind of saved your vines. Your vines will probably be stronger going forward. They have one less year of wear and tear of growing these grapes. So when you're doing your calculation, take that into account, right?
You're forgetting he needs those grapes now to put food on
Well,
the
you're
table.
gonna pay for those grapes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The assumption is it made vines and made grapes.
We'll go with it. So kachas gufna v'lo masami. I don't know which of the two hold of this svara, but that svara is the difference between these two shitas. But Abaya says, "Oh, you think lo masami? I have masami. I actually think I know, based on some of these other halachas, which one of them says what. I know mantana dechayish l'chakachash gufna. I know which of these two shitas are chayish for this. How do I know? Reb Shimon ben Yehudi is Reb Shimon ben Yehuda. Tanya, these are some tough prices to read. Reb Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Reb Shimon ben Asya Ones Eino Mashalim Misatzar Nimdesha Sofel Itzayir Tachas Baila. When a man unfortunately is ma'anes a girl, Bethula, so in addition to the 50 shkalim of the knas, you have to pay the tsar, ripui shabbos, all that kind of stuff. So one of the shitas is you don't actually pay the tsar. Why? Because ultimately she's going to have bia with her husband, and she's going to have the tsar a different time. This is that same exact idea, right? When we view how to damage, right, how to calculate the damage, we do take into account the future, and we say, why should they have to pay the tsar? The tsar is something that anyway was going to have to happen. But the Chachamim responded, they said, Amrulo, Eino Doma, Nevelas Baratzon, Nevelas Ba'ones. I mean, I hear you, but obviously there's a different tsar, and therefore you still have to pay the tsar. What's the point? The point is, we see that this shita of Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, he's the one that's chayish for this kachash gufna. He's the one that looks into the future and says, you know what? When evaluating the damage, we need to take into account the future, whatever it is. And Amar Abaya, Hani Tanai, Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, Amru Davar Echad. I have a more Tanaim who agree to this idea. Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, Hada Amar. Reb Shimon ben Yehuda clearly agrees to this. That's what we just said. And Hani Tanai, we have a few other Tanaim. Mahi, who are they? Decided Reb Yossi Omer Neki Chaya, and Ben Azi Amar Neki Mizonos. The case would be if, unfortunately, guys were fighting and they knock a pregnant woman and she miscarries. And we had these complicated sugyas of Shvach Vlados and Mei Vlados. But there's these two shitas, and one of them says, when you're evaluating the damage, keep in mind, she didn't have this baby, right? So you should deduct the hospital bill. She didn't end up ever having the baby, right? The other one says she's a pregnant woman, and therefore she eats a lot. Well, she's no longer pregnant, so she's not going to eat a lot. So in calculating how much you owe this couple, deduct the added groceries, right? So the point is, again, we have these Tanaim who subscribe to this theory of you need to look into the future and calculating the damage to say, well, wait 1 second, we got to have the full picture. How much was the husband saved by not having the pregnancy anymore? So the Gemara says,
So all the way, I pruned your grapes for you.
Yeah.
They're going to be worth more.
Exactly. So Manda Amar, again, these are hard svaras, but Manda Amar Niki Chaya, according to the Manda Amar who says that you deduct for the chaya, for the not having to hire a midwife. So kol sheken nikim mazonos. Of course, he's going to agree that you also have to deduct for the less food that she needs. But manda amar nikim mazonos. But according to the manda amar, says you deduct for the food. Aval nikichaya lo. He doesn't necessarily agree that you have to deduct damages for the chaya. The amar lay, because the husband could say it's a didi pekichi. My wife is very smart. Lo mabaya chaya, and she never hires a midwife. I was thinking it's davar beito mato. This is this week's parsha, right? Where the Shifra and Pua basically said these Jewish women, they didn't need my services. So that's what the husband's saying over here. Don't deduct my damage because I had to hire a midwife. I wouldn't hire a midwife. My wife does this on her own. We do a home birth. Either way. Okay. Rav Papa, Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yeshua, Avad Uvda Kavasei, Rav Nachman, B'Shishim. So that's how they paskin. They paskin that you do this shishim, like we've been talking about all day. Lishna, Harina, Rav Papa, Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yeshua, Shamu Dikla, Agav Katina Da'ara. So a different Lishna. The Art Scroll says that they're actually saying the exact same thing. When you value the tree that was knocked down, which is what Rav Nachman was talking about, you do it agav, a small piece of land that would have fit 60 of these trees. The halacha is like Rav Papa and Rav Huna Braid Rav Yeshua when it comes to the dikla de arma. This is a certain type of palm tree that you would do shishim. But the halacha like the reish galusa, you look at the palm tree on its own, the dikla parsa. In the type of dikla, that's a dikla parsa. So I guess Rashi says this is a much more expensive palm tree, and therefore, if it was that type of palm tree, we would look at the palm tree on its own. If it's a different type of palm tree, we look at it with shish. We'll do the next Gemara, and then we'll have to make up some tomorrow. So Eliezer is Ira, a man by the name of Eliezer is Ira. He was Hava Sayim Misani Uchmi. He wore black shoes. And he walked around in the Shulchan Aruch. Rashi says this wearing of black shoes was a sign of a velus. So Ashkechuhu, the Bay Reish Galusa, the Reish Galusa found him. But Amrle, Misani, what are you wearing these black shoes for? Amrlu, to come out Vilna Yerushalayim. What do you mean? Why aren't you wearing black shoes, right? I'm in a velus over Yerushalayim. Amrule, Ad Chashivas, Lasabule, Yerushalayim, Savar, you are Rahava, and Asiyua, Bechavshua. They thought this was a gaiva, and therefore they literally put him in prison. Right? It's like amazing. There was just such an avera that this guy was displaying gaiva, and therefore they thought it was, appropriate to lock him up. Amruluhu, this is like the best response to someone suggesting that you're about gaiva. Gabarabana, what do you mean? Meaning it's appropriate for me to do this. This isn't me being about gaiva. Exactly, right? So that's a great response, right? But clearly the idea is there are certain people that are on the level that they can walk around in black shoes. The Reish Galusa didn't feel that this guy was on that madrega, but this guy said, I am on that madrega. So Amrulay, Mani Adina, prove it to us that you are on this madrega. So Amrlahu, Atun Bai Minai Milsa, either you guys give me a fare, ask me something, or Ana Ibai Minai Milsa, or I'll ask you guys something and I'll prove that I'm Amrulay Bayat. You go ahead, ask us something. So Amarlu, Haiman de cuts kufra, my mishalim. A guy cuts down these budding dates, so they're not quite dates yet, they're in the infancy stage. How should we evaluate the damage? Amrulay, mishalim de kufra. I don't know, you got to pay the value of whatever you did. But he says, but one day they're going to be dates. If you only pay what he damaged now, you're not paying enough. So Amrulay, so mishalim de tamri, so pay the dates. But Amarlu, halav tamri shaklamine. I didn't damage dates. I damaged infant dates. Amrulay, so Amalan, at. So, all right, you got us. Tell us, what's the halacha? So Amrlu, we said, B'shishim, we would do this using this methodology of Shishim. Amrulay, so they said to him, Man Amar Kavasech, who holds like you? So Amrlahu, Hashmuel Chai, Shmuel is alive, Kayim. So Shadru Kamei Shmuel, they came before Shmuel, and Amrlahu, Shaper Kamarlahu, B'shishim, B'shaku. Shmuel said he's exactly right, and therefore they let him go. Should we try to get to the Mishnah? To Reb Shimon, Amar Achla Peiros Gemur. Reb Shimon argued with this whole thing, and he said, if you eat produce that is Gemurin, then you just pay the value of the peiros. You don't do all these valuations with Shishim. My time, what's Pshat and Reb Shimon? Amar Achmana Ubir B'stei Acher. Right, that was, if you remember earlier in the daf, what was the source for even doing this valuation based on another relative value? It was a relative field. It was Ubir B'stei Acher. But Hani Nili midi detarich l'sadeh. But Rav Shimon says that's only something that still requires nourishment from a field. Hani, once you have fully ripened produce, Once it doesn't need the sud anymore, now you got to pay the stuff, whatever the full amount. So Amr Avuna Bar Chia, Amr Rav Yirmiyah Bar Abba, Don Rav K'Rav Meir, Psak Hilchas Rav Shimon. Two unrelated items. Rav once paskined like Rav Meir, and he also taught the halacha like Rav Shimon. Don Rav K'Rav Meir. What's this halacha that he was paskin like Rav Meir? The Tanya Chasav L'Rishon below Chasma Lo L'Sheni Chasma Lo Ibdak Subasa Divrei Rav Meir. So the case is again totally unrelated. A case in Subas. You got a woman. All of the man's property is Meshuba to her ksuba. Right. He sells one piece of property. She has no problem with it. Then he sells the last of his property, and she goes along with it. She signs along. So now the guy dies, or whatever it is. She goes to ksuba, and she goes to the second buyer, and she says, "You got to pay me my ksuba." And he says, "What do you mean? You sign on, right?" So Rav Meir says the guy's got a point. She loses the case. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yechol Hisha Tomer Nachas Rochas Yisrael Labayli Atem Malach Amalai. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, she can win because she can say, yeah, I signed along. I was trying to save my marriage, right? Clearly, this was a marriage on the rocks. So I was trying to do what I could for my husband. So, but you shouldn't have bought that thing. Don't look at the fact that I signed on as any sort of proof, right? Because I was just trying to work things out with my husband. Either way, Rav Meir doesn't hold of that shita of that svara. Why? Because he says, remember, the first one, you had no problem not signing along. So from the fact that you didn't sign the first one, that shows that even when you signed the second one,
Like
it wasn't just
property.
at that. So again, you got to get into ksubas. You're exactly right. And Rashi speaks it out. You're exactly right. But the bottom line is that was Rav Meir Shita, and Rav Paskins in this case, in a similar case, like Rav Meir. What's the case of Psak Hilchos like Rav Shimon? When did he teach the Psak like Rav Shimon? He had it Tanan, Rav Shimon Omer Achla Peros Gemurin Mishalemes. This is the last halacha of our Mishnah, this halacha that we just spoke about by Rav Shimon, that when you have peros that are fully ripened, you don't do these calculations of shishim, you just pay the produce.